listening to Sasquatch Syndicate.
911, what are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was? Was it a person or an animal or?
I can't tell. All I know is that my central light came on and I just happened to glimpse and see this thing running across the yard.
And all the ape believers don't want any of the paranormal believers to say anything because they're all whacked and screwed up and we don't want them. And all the paranormal believers don't want to go to the ape believers saying, well, you're all closed-minded. You're not open to the fact that it does this and it does that.
And I look over my left shoulder and this creature is running through the woods and it's bulldozing the brush down. And I knew, man, this thing is going to get me.
Sasquatch Syndicate. I'm your host Chuck out in Seattle, Washington, along with Paul in Portland, Oregon. Thanks to all of our listeners and those following us at SasquatchSyndicate.com and on our social media outlets. For those participating in the Sasquatch Syndicate monthly t-shirt giveaway, this month's winner was Gabriela Gonzalez from Riverside, California. So Gabriela, thanks for listening to the show, and please check your Facebook for winner notification. Happy April, everyone, and we hope you're enjoying your Easter weekend. A few announcements before we get started tonight. For those out in the Pacific Northwest, we are 21 days away from WinCon. WinCon is Wenatchee, Washington's pop culture convention. It will have guest stars, media stars, vendors, artists, games, panel discussions, and prizes, as well as a cosplay contest. So plenty of activities and a lot of fun for the entire family. Sasquatch Syndicate will also, of course, have a booth there, and we're going to have a special area, Sasquatch in Comics. So for those that aren't aware, Sasquatch as a brand has appeared on many comic books and graphic novels over the years, and the event gives us a chance to help educate folks at the booth on what's happening with the phenomenon here in the Cascades, as well as attract others to join the cause. So thanks again for all those that wrote in that are planning on stopping by the event, and we'll look forward to seeing you there in Wenatchee. Also, before I forget, spring is here, and as we get back to research and scientific data collection in our upcoming World Traveler series this summer, I wanted to share Sasquatch Syndicate has launched a new program called Squatch Scouts. Squatch Scouts is a scientific research and merit earning program for kids ages 4 through 14. Kids can enroll in the program at SasquatchSyndicate.com under Store, and upon registration, they'll receive a shirt and a membership login that will provide them scientific missions for evidence collection. As each mission is completed, kids will log their completion and receive reward points. These reward points can then be redeemed for merchandise through the reward catalog on the website. And of course, our hope is by joining the program, this will inspire more kids to get outside in nature, learn about science, and hopefully inspire the next generation of citizen scientists. Also, for the parents out there that wish to run their own clan of Squatch Scouts, there is an application guide should you wish to run a program in your area. Application guidelines are also posted on the website under Store. More on Squatch Scouts this spring, but let's help kids get outside and off the electronic devices. So speaking of the next generation, tonight we're joined by the Crypto Kid, or Colin Schneider. Colin is one of the youngest active cryptozoologists in the United States. So Colin, welcome to Sasquatch Syndicate. And if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your background for our listeners, and really how you became interested in the phenomenon of the unknown.
I live in Portage County, Ohio, and for your listeners who aren't quite familiar, Portage County is kind of infamous in the UFO field because in the 60s there was this UFO that a couple cops saw one night, and they chased it and followed it all the way into Pennsylvania. And that's a fairly well-known case in the UFO sphere. So I kind of grew up in hearing about these stories of Bigfoot in the woods and, you know, the UFO that the cops chased, but I never really knew much about it or cared. I mean, when I was in elementary school, I was a nerd, first and foremost. I always had several comic books in my backpack that I was reading I had arguments on which was a better superhero, Captain America or Batman or whatever. And so I was very into comic books and movie monsters and just basically everything that a nerd can be interested in, science fiction, fantasy, etc. So I remember my dad, when I was about 7-ish, gave me a book called Mysterious Monsters. And it was really interesting because it was kind of this companion book from the 70s for a documentary of the same title. And it intrigued me because it had this really neat cover of this big, looming humanoid creature silhouette walking toward the camera, and you see the sunset behind it, and it's very vivid and very interesting. It caught my eye. I read it and thought, this is very interesting because I've also been extremely interested in animals. I've had tons and tons of pets my entire life. I used to collect toads from outside and bring them in. We had this fish tank. I would just put them in and keep them and feed them and stuff. But the Mysterious Monsters book, what caught my interest is it was talking about monsters, these humanoid hulking beasts that live in the forest and scare people, but it also treated them like animals. It was looking at them from from the cryptozoological perspective of, well, these are things that people see. What in zoology could possibly explain that, or could they be new animals unknown by science? And that just fascinated me. And about that time, the show Monster Quest came on, and I had watched a bunch of episodes and gotten really interested in that. And I heard in pretty much every episode there was this guy called Loren Coleman being interviewed. And I'm like, that guy kind of seems to know his stuff. He really reminded me of Professor X in the X-Men comic books. He just was always sitting down and explaining things in a very level-headed manner, and he just seemed to give that air of authority and knowing what's going on. And for a long time, he was my hero, and growing up, he really influenced me. I got many of his books with a little bit of allowance I got when I was a kid. And a couple years ago, we were going up to Maine for a family vacation, and I was super excited because I knew that the International Cryptozoology Museum was right there, and we were going to go right past it when we were headed up to the national park, the Acadia National Park, where we were going to be vacationing. And I begged my dad to take us, and we went, and I got to meet Loren Coleman, and I got to talk to him, and it was just an incredibly exciting experience. And I remember walking out of the museum with this feeling of just fascination, and as I hopped in the car, I kind of decided, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to be a monster hunter.
So, Colin, of course, Paul and I have met Loren multiple times, and certainly a wonderful, eloquent speaker, a lot of information, and very well respected on the subject and cryptozoology in general. But what was it about that meeting that you had with Loren and meeting him for the first time that really kind of lit a fire under you?
But for me, my hero was always that bearded gentleman on the cryptid shows that was very polite and just gave this air of, I know what I'm talking about. And that just fascinated me. And getting to meet him, for me, was like meeting a rock star. Or it was like a kid who plays basketball getting to meet LeBron James or something. He was the person to meet. And I think, honestly, that was incredibly awesome, but if I had just met him like passing on the street, it wouldn't have been as significant. But I met him, and then I got to go look around in the museum, and I got to see this really neat diorama of the Patterson-Gimlin film, and I got to see the actual casts of a handful of cases that I knew very well, and I got to see a supposedly real Ren Pendek hair. And just all these things over and over and over that just kind of built in my head that this is such a neat field to be in and is so fascinating that I think over anything it was not so much meeting Lauren, although that was a huge impact. I think it was more seeing all of the evidence or all of these artifacts, if you will, in one place.
So, Colin, you spoke a little bit about comics, but growing up, were you aware of Sasquatch, being perceived as a superhero or a villain throughout comic book lore?
Well, there were these these graphic mystery series that my library carried, and it was everything from Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, UFOs, some unusual murders. There was a Jack the Ripper one, and they were in the comic book style. And they were kind of interesting. I have a couple that I ended up picking up, but up until just about last year, I never really paid much attention to it. I mean, the well-known character Wolverine, part of the X-Men, when he first appeared in The Incredible Hulk, the villain that they were fighting was Wendigo, which, for those of you who don't know, is one of the possible names, variant names for a Bigfoot-type creature, originated, if I'm remembering correctly, by the Algonquin tribe up in Canada of Native Americans. So, I mean, it's always kind of been there, but I never really paid much attention to it until, like, last year when I found this comic series called Proof. It was kind of interesting. It was followed this government agency of secret agents that went around the country and even around the world to capture cryptids that they treated kind of like monsters, like actual movie monsters that were endangering the public. But one of the cool things about the comic book was there was a Bigfoot that was kind of civilized, and he wore this suit and had this cool-looking gun that was the main character's partner, and he was kind of funny. It's a really interesting series. I think Image Comics was the publisher for that.
Yeah, it's really interesting how many people aren't aware of how prevalent Sasquatch is in comics over the last few decades. He's appeared fighting the Hulk, He-Man, The Thing, of course, the $6 Million Man. And there's been a lot of competitions on bringing Sasquatch back to life in comics. Even at Rose City Comic Con in Portland, Oregon last year, there was a Sasquatch in the City competition. So a lot of folks out there trying to bring it back to the main stage, bringing it back to, of course, pop culture, and of course helps us, promote research and discovery. So Colin, before we get going tonight on your thoughts about the subject of Sasquatch and the phenomena, can you share a little bit about your podcast and radio show you have going?
So my podcast, it's a live internet radio show. It's called The Crypto Kid, and kind of what I'm trying to do with it is have all these big names on there, but kind of delve into different perspectives that a lot of people don't really talk about on the show. For example, we spent an entire episode talking just about the possibility of the survival of the eastern puma, which is kind of a big subject in cryptozoology, but it's not something that a lot of people talk about. So since I am a kid and I can really start getting into these lesser known and in my opinion more important subjects, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give this fresh perspective on cryptozoology with my show.
Yeah, Colin, this is Paul. It's just a real pleasure having you on the show tonight. And I want to talk just a little bit about your podcast. And one of the things that makes you such a great interviewer is you're very disarming. Part of it is, like you said, you're a kid, right? So I think it allows us to kind of take some liberties and go a little bit farther and hypothesize some certain things, but certainly very disarming and an excellent interviewer. But what I wanted to know, what really fascinates you most about the study of the paranormal?
That's a multi-part question. I think for cryptozoology specifically, it's a combination of the pursuit for new species of animals, because like I said, animals have always been one of my absolute favorite things to just look into, one of my favorite topics to read about. And also it's the pursuit of monsters, the idea that these things that terrified me as a child might actually exist in one form or another. Now, with UFOs, I think I didn't really get interested in it until I started looking, until I met Stan Gordon, who has written extensively on the idea that UFOs and Bigfoot specifically are connected. And that kind of interested me in the subject, and I kind of built an interest from there. I mean, I have a lot of vintage UFO books, including a signed copy of They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers by Gray Barker. And it's an interesting topic. I'm more interested in it as it connects to cryptozoology specifically.
And of course, as many of our listeners are aware, Stan Gordon did appear back in June 2016 on Sasquatch Syndicate talking about the Pennsylvania UFO casebook. But Colin, can you talk a little bit about how you met Stan and really what his influence has been on your work as well?
Yeah, well, I met Stan 2 years ago at a Mensa conference in Pittsburgh. And beforehand, my dad, knowing my interest in UFOs and Bigfoot, he says, "Hey, there's this guy that's going to be talking on UFOs and Bigfoot. You should check it out." And he told me the name, and I recognized it, but it didn't quite click. So I looked up on his website, and I was reading some things, and I was interested. So when I attended his talk, it just blew me away. This was really the first time that I had met anyone who was active in the field and really working. Like, I had met Lauren Coleman at the Cryptozoology Museum before, but we really didn't get to talk, and he really didn't say much. He just kind of stood by the door waiting for more people to come. So, like, this was the first time that I really got to hear someone in person talk about the paranormal and UFOs and stuff. I was incredibly excited. I remember I went up to him afterwards, and we spent a good hour and a half talking and just having this great conversation about Bigfoot and whatever. And I made my dad go out to the bank so he could pull out some money so I could get all of his books. I stayed up all night and read them all and everything. And Stan gave me his email, and we have been emailing back and forth. I went to the Mothman Festival right after that because it was in September. And he grabbed me and went around and introduced me to all of the speakers and some of the other vendors that were there. He introduced me to Ken Gerhard, who is another person that I work closely with, and I've had this great relationship with professionally. He introduced me to Nick Redfern at another conference. So he's really the reason I am where I am. He's the person who pushed me to really get some articles published, to start really delving into the research and start getting myself out there. And he's really been a great mentor in all of it.
Yeah, I can't say enough about Stan Gordon. He's just such a great advocate for the phenomenon, everything from aliens to Sasquatch, and of course all the work he did around the Kecksburg case out there in Pennsylvania. So just a wonderful advocate, a wonderful human being, and just a cannon of information. And he has so much over the years to share. I think he's been doing it more than 60 years at this point. So can't say enough about his work. So Colin, I know at one point, I know that you had mentioned you had a fascination with ghosts or potentially even had your own paranormal experience, but can you share a little bit about that?
The house that I grew up in, outside my childhood bedroom's door, there was this long hallway that every night I would hear these loud footsteps going back and forth in the hallway. And when I asked my dad about it, because I thought he was the one doing it and keeping me up, and he said no. Later I found out that actually when he was my age, he heard the very same thing because I was in his childhood room. So that kind of made me interested in ghosts for a long time, and I still read about them, but right now my main focus is cryptozoology. I think it's going to stay that way for a very long time, purely because of my love for monsters and my love for animals.
So Colin, of course, Paul and I were talking about, you've had such a luxury of growing up in this information age where you've had more access to data than even most of us adults have had, over the years. But as you get into, the phenomenon, aliens, Sasquatch, everything in between, as you start trying to connect the dots and kind of seeing where data points intersect around Sasquatch and UFOs, kind of what are your thoughts about that?
Well, when I bring up the Bigfoot UFO connection specifically, I don't really look at it as Bigfoot's an extraterrestrial or even Bigfoot is connected to extraterrestrials, because I personally feel that the idea that UFOs are inherently extraterrestrial is kind of a fallacy. I feel that there are a lot of problems with the extraterrestrial theory. I'm not completely throwing it out, because I do think it's a valid idea. I'm just not completely convinced that it's the only idea. And I think that there's a lot of things that are contrary to that idea. For example, let's say Bigfoot is an extraterrestrial. There would be the amount of evolutionary chance for another humanoid that is incredibly close physically and anatomically to humans, incredibly astronomical. I mean, we're talking about a completely separate planet and a completely separate biosphere with likely completely different niches for the animals or life forms to evolve into. So the odds that even a life form that even resembles even just mammals in general is completely astronomical, and that's one of the biggest problems I have with the idea that Bigfoot's an alien. But I do think that there is a significant connection to Bigfoot and UFOs. UFOs being unidentified flying objects, not alien craft, just something weird in the sky that people see. Because there's been a lot of sightings in the same area at the same time with Bigfoot and UFOs, or they have been seen interacting with one another in a handful of cases, and in my opinion, it's enough to really make you wonder and look at the idea.
Colin, as you mentioned, I know you're a Lauren Coleman fan, and I know you've read, True Stories of Apes in America and many other cryptid books around, the flesh and blood camp of, undiscovered primate or potential relic hominin. I'm just curious kind of what your thoughts are in your opinion around the possibility that there could be, this undiscovered primate roaming the forests of North America.
Well, for a long time, I was of the opinion that Bigfoot is just an unknown animal, an undiscovered ape. And when I was in elementary school and into middle school, I was very gung-ho about the idea that the Gigantopithecus was an evolutionary ancestor of Bigfoot, which is still a popular idea in the field today. And I actually got a chance at my middle school to do a 4-month research project about Bigfoot. And it was supposed to be, I was in the gifted class, the gifted program at my middle school. And I was definitely excelling above even the lessons that we had to do at the time. So I got called in by my principal, and she said, okay, I want you to think about a project that you could do, research, book report, something that would be about 4 months long, and that would culminate into this presentation in front of her and then the vice principal and maybe my history teacher and maybe my science teacher. It would depend on their schedules. And before she even finished explaining what she wanted me to do with the project, I said, I want to do a Bigfoot project. So what it ended up being was, it was a 2-part presentation. The first part was about 25 minutes long, and it was kind of just laying out the groundwork of what Bigfoot is, what evidence exists, the main contributors to the field, just the general Bigfoot 101, if you will. And then the second part was the bigger, more tasking part of the project, where I had to determine whether or not a specific theory about Bigfoot was possible. So obviously I chose the Bigfoot Gigantopithecus theory because that was the one I knew the best. And so I started off, this has got to be what it is. This is the only thing that makes sense. And I started looking into what the Gigantopithecus is, the handful of bones that we have, the handful of fossils that we have that is kind of what we have kind of been able to hypothesize what the rest of it would look like. And that's the way we did it, not we, but the way scientists did it. So the Gigantopithecus, we only have a handful of fossilized teeth, a partial jawbone, and from that scientists were actually able to determine what the animal would have really looked like. And it was more or less a really big gorilla-looking creature with an orangutan type face, and it was 8-ish feet tall, and that's kind of what it looked like. So right there, once I really started delving into it, I kind of went, well, since it's probably not bipedal, that runs it into a little bit of a problem. But it was still a couple 100,000 years ago to 1 million years ago, so there would potentially be time for it to evolve to be bipedal. So all's not lost yet. Then I started looking into migration patterns of great apes today, specifically chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas, because those are kind of the big three of great apes. And I kind of decided that because Gigantopithecus, when it was around, it lived in China and parts of India. So that would mean for it to cross over into America, it would have to go up through Mongolia, through Russia, and over the Bering Strait, and then down through Canada and spread it around. So I started looking into great ape migration patterns to see would there be any reason for them to go up that way except for loss of food. And it was really hard to track down migration patterns because the great apes really don't have migrationary routes. Each family group, they move in their own way, in this own pattern that they kind of choose. There's nothing like all of the geese fly south for winter or anything. So that was a little difficult. And the final thing that kind of made me go, maybe this isn't such a reliable idea is the fact that Gigantopithecus was primarily a bamboo eater. From what we could tell from the teeth, that is what its main source of food would logically be, as well as some other plants and fibers. So thinking about it, the Gigantopithecus would have to go up through the Mongolian desert into Russia, which is one of the harshest climates on the planet, over the Bering Strait, and into a continent that had absolutely no bamboo whatsoever. Granted, the world back then was a lot different, but it was still harsh enough for it to be a lot less likely that the Gigantopithecus went up. Now, I'm not saying that it's absolutely not an ancestor to the Gigantopithecus. We don't have a complete fossil record, so we don't know if there is another species of Gigantopithecus that was bipedal or was able to make the trip. It's just by looking at the evidence and the facts we know about that species right now, it would be, in my opinion, illogical. And that's kind of what I decided. So that kind of made it harder for me to think, well, Bigfoot is a biological animal. So I'm not sure with any of the ideas, the idea that it's an extraterrestrial, that it's expected UFOs, or that it's a biological animal. I'm not sure. And the way I look at it, we don't know enough about the animal itself, the Bigfoot itself, to really be able to determine yes or no for really any of the ideas.
So, Colin, kind of growing up as a millennial in the information age where you have access to every TV program at your fingertips, YouTube, the internet, all of the information on the subject, and being younger and kind of being a sponge. I was just curious, as you watch television programs and research, and a lot of the research being done at night, can you share with the audience what your thoughts are on why Sasquatch or Bigfoot would be out there at night, and why do you think that most of the research is done at night and not during the daytime?
Well, actually, humans don't see great at night, and that's probably one of the main traits of a hominin. But other great apes, like chimpanzees or bonobos or gorillas, actually see very well in the dark. And gorillas specifically have a lot of activity during the night. They move around a lot at night, and they have a lot of hunting sometimes at night, or they feed at night. So it's not completely implausible that Bigfoot would have excellent vision at night, because we do see that in other great apes. It's just that hominins, specifically the Homo genus, just doesn't have great night vision.
So in terms of, the fossil record and skeletal remains, kind of what are your thoughts, kind of being one of the younger researchers? Why do you think we don't have skeletal remains?
I'm not sure. I mean, being where I live in a very rural area. I mean, I have 2 farms right next to my house. And for the longest time, my school was right across from a pig farm. So we kind of live in the middle of nowhere. So I've gotten to know a lot of hunters and people who are outdoors all the time. And when you talk to them, they don't see a lot of skeletons of even animals that we know to be in the area and to be extremely common. I mean, I've been in Boy Scouts up until last year, basically my entire life. We went deep woods backpacking and a lot of outdoor trips. I think I was in the woods more weekends than I was at home for most of my life. And I've only ever seen 2 deer skeletons, and there are deer literally everywhere. So I don't think that it's completely implausible that a skeleton or a body of an intelligent animal would be able to be hidden. I think that looking at what we know about our own evolution, both sociologically and biologically, they probably do have some type of funerary custom where they get rid of the body or bury it or whatever. And that would definitely conceal the body, and probably by the time anyone would be in the area, the bones would either be gone from the area or hidden under stuff. So if you're not looking incredibly, incredibly closely at whatever bone you might find, you won't know it's there.
So, Colin, what about habitat encroachment? And, do you think a creature of that size of a Sasquatch could mask itself in the forest? What are your thoughts on that? Why aren't there more game trails? Why aren't there more, deforestation or damage to the forest that would really pinpoint where these creatures are?
Well, so in the 1800s, late 1800s, gorillas, specifically the mountain gorillas, were still an unknown species. They weren't known by science. They weren't recognized to exist. There was the lowland gorillas that were kind of accepted, but the mountain gorillas were still just, the tribesmen in the area heard a story about these angry, hairy forest men that live in there, and it's just hilarious. And then you had the handful of hunters that believed it, and they went to go hunt the man beasts. And they had an incredibly hard time doing it. The reason we can find great apes now is because we know enough about their behavior to be able to track them. And we know they're there. But the difference between great apes and Bigfoot is that Bigfoot, if it exists, would be almost our level of intelligence. So, and they've been out in the woods their entire species lives. They have more outdoors instincts than we do. So being hidden would kind of be an essential part of their survival. Thus, they would work even harder at doing so. And I think that there is a low enough number of them that if they don't want to be found or have any evidence of them being there, they probably generally will not be found, or there will not be any evidence found.
So, Colin, as you're kind of learning and kind of growing as a researcher, and this has been just fascinating. I'm just so excited about where you're at in terms of your evolution of knowledge. But can you share a little bit about what your thoughts are on just kind of the fossil record and kind of what you know about that?
Well, we know up until, oh gosh, I think I'm going to get my years wrong, so don't fault me on this if I'm slightly off, but I think up until 20,000 years ago, we know that we were sharing the world with at least one other hominid species known as the Neanderthals. And everyone thinks of Neanderthals as the cavemen with the big clubs that bop people on the head and just are savages. But actually, they had almost complete control, not really control, but they were the ones who primarily inhabited most of Europe up until they started going extinct. And it's actually been proven that about 50% of humans today have Neanderthal genes in them. They are part Neanderthal. So there's obviously a lot of crossbreeding between the species. And now this isn't Bigfoot, but one of the other well-known hairy humanoids from around the world is the Alma and Almasty of Russia and Mongolia and that kind of area. And for a long time now, I have thought that if the Neanderthals would survive anywhere in the world, that's where they would be. Russia, Mongolia, like that part of the world, because it's incredibly remote. There are places that no one's been, probably ever, and it'd be the perfect place for anything to hide. And actually, there's an incredibly large history of sightings in that area. And I'm a member of a group known as the Center for Fortean Zoology based out of the United Kingdom. And we have been sending, we have sent, I think, 3 or 4, maybe more, expedition groups out to Russia and the Ukraine and other parts of that area to look for the Almasty. And I think we're sending one out later this year, actually. So, and we're probably the only group not from Russia that is looking for these creatures still. And I think that if there are, even more likely than Bigfoot, if there are other species of hominins still around today, that's where they would be.
So, Colin, as you know, you're still a student and you're coming up through the scientific method. Of course, you've got an interest in, you know, the extraterrestrial and paranormal and everything in between related to, you know, cryptozoology. As you kind of think about, you know, what you've heard on the subject regarding interdimensional travel and the science we don't understand, you know, the woo phenomenon, kind of where does that strike you, and kind of what are your thoughts behind that?
Well, with the interdimensional idea, I mean, I think that's one of the absolutely most fascinating theories out there, and I think it's also one of the most groundbreaking in the both cryptozoological and ufological fields. And I think that it's a fairly plausible one, but the problem is a lot of the researchers who support that idea are pointing to quantum quantum physics, and all that weird part of science that we don't quite understand. And the way I look at it is it's a definitely great idea, and I think that it should be brought up a lot more than it is, but I also don't think that the science is quite there to support it. I think that we're using science that we don't quite understand yet to support something that we totally don't understand. So I think that it definitely is something that shouldn't go away, but I also think that it isn't necessarily supported by science right now. That being said, I think that folklore supports the idea of interdimensional beings incredibly well. I recently got published in the Cryptid Culture magazine for the second time, in which I wrote an article discussing the idea of fairy folklore and how it connects to specific cryptids, including Bigfoot. And what I kind of concluded was there's a lot of parallels between both cryptozoological cases of Bigfoot and the Native American ideas of what Bigfoot is and the fairy lore of the United Kingdom and other parts of Europe. For example, one of the biggest aspects of Bigfoot literature, specifically in the 1910s and 20s, was the idea that wild men kidnapped people from their camping sites or even their homes and took them into the woods for the intention of mating. The best known example is the Albert Ostman case, which really kind of brought that idea into the popular sphere of cryptozoology. And what I kind of point out in my article is that fairies were incredibly well known. They were infamous for it, for kidnapping children or adults or travelers and bringing them into the fairy realm, either to raise the children as one of their own, or the travelers that they kidnapped to mate with. Because in some of the myths and legends in Scandinavia and other parts of Eastern Europe specifically, it was believed that the fairies were going extinct. Their race was dying, and they were trying to support their race by interbreeding with the humans. So that's one of the interesting parallels. Another one is obviously the UFO connection between both fairies and Bigfoot, which I've mentioned briefly with Bigfoot. And a lot of the ideas of fairies have been connected to UFOs. For example, crop circles have been connected to the idea of fairy circles, that when you walk in the forest and you find a strange ring of dead grass or a ring of mushrooms, that's a fairy ring or fairy circle, and that's where they played or danced the night before. And then it's just the general idea, especially in the legends of the Pacific Northwest, that Bigfoot is this protector of the wilderness, this champion of nature, if you will. And part of the role of fairies, even though they were these kind of mischievous little twerps, more or less, they were also very protective over nature, and they really defended it if people tried to encroach on their land. Even today, in Iceland especially, you will always find these news stories. Road construction halted because elves supposedly live in the area. You find all these news stories where the people who live there are afraid that the elves or fairies will kind of rise up against them and cause problems if they build on their land, the nature.
So, Colin, of course, you're still in school and you don't have all the resources that, all the adults have to go out researching and exploring and doing all these things. But if you were able to research, where would you focus your energy?
Well, since I can't really go out in the woods and look for stuff, and I haven't really gotten a lot of cases from people who want to talk about their experiences, what I really do anymore is I do two different things. I look into the folklore of creatures, especially Bigfoot and other hairy humanoids around the world. You got the big gray man of Scotland, and then the Alma of Russia, and the Yowie of Australia. And you have these beautiful, wonderful, fascinating stories that accompany these creatures that I don't think get enough attention because they really do have a lot of interesting parallels with the cases today. And another aspect that I look into with Bigfoot today isn't really any of these theories. I try to avoid any of that. What I really try to do is focus on the phenomenon as a whole or a specific part of the sighting. For example, I wrote an article, and I'm working on a book, about the idea that other cryptids besides the chupacabra might have vampiric natures. Because I found a lot of cases that connect Bigfoot, lake monsters, and even creatures like Mothman, the flying humanoids, to these livestock mutilations that would be connected to the chupacabra had a Bigfoot or another cryptid not been seen at the scene of the attack. I found a lot of cases and a lot of legends, especially in South America and Australia, of livestock, pets, and just wild animals in general being attacked, mutilated, and drained of blood by large hairy humanoids. So I try to avoid any idea, whether it be the flesh and blood theory or the extraterrestrial idea. I really try to avoid any of those because I feel that if you really spend a lot of time with one specific theory, you bias yourself with all of the other ideas that are contrary to that. So what I like to do is I kind of focus on the weirder aspects or the aspects that I feel aren't getting enough attention and kind of point out that, hey guys, look, this is also something that's going on with Bigfoot, with UFOs, whatever, and I feel that it needs more attention. And I think that I really am in a great position to do that because I am still young and I'm still young into this field, and I haven't really gotten jaded into one specific camp or another because of politics. I'm lucky enough to have avoided most of that yet.
So, Colin, of course, there's probably a lot of kids and younger adolescents like yourself out there listening today that kind of want to enter the field, but what could you share with them on maybe some suggestions on how to best enter the topic?
The biggest advice I can give to any kids, and I work with several other people my age in the field, and I'm actually working on a book with one of them. But the biggest recommendation I can give to people and the young kids interested in this field is turn off the television and read. Read as much as you can, not just about Bigfoot, but about cryptozoology as a whole, about animals, about evolution, about history, about even UFOs, about anything that might be labeled paranormal or fringe. Because a lot of that comes up with a lot of things. Bigfoot, for example, is excellent. You have all these connections to UFOs, and you have all these ideas that link it to paranormal theories. And if you're in the field, I think that it's essential to, even if you don't agree with the ideas, to at least understand them. So the biggest advice I can give is read. Loren Coleman, all of his books are absolutely fantastic. Another big influence that I had was John Keel. His Strange Creatures from Time and Space is one of my absolute favorite books, and the Mothman Prophecies is also very fantastic. Linda Godfrey about the Dogman phenomenon, and then she's written extensively on just cryptozoology in general. I would recommend Ken Gerhard as well. So just read as much as you possibly can, and just once you feel comfortable enough, if you really, really, really want to work into the field, contact some of these authors. I mean, that's what I've done, and I have found that I have become great friends with these people that I had grown up reading about and reading their writing and just almost idolizing them as a kid. And then I can now call myself a friend of Ken Gerhard or a friend of Nick Redfern, and it's just an awesome experience. So I would definitely also recommend just contacting them if your parents say that's okay, and ask them questions. And also, write. I mean, it may not be something that everyone's interested in, but I've found that writing is definitely the easiest way to kind of get accepted into the field. I mean, when I was starting out, I was just kind of a kid who had a lot of knowledge about this stuff, and I wasn't quite a researcher. But now I've been published 10 times in magazines, including Cryptid Culture, and I'm going to be published in Fate sometime soon, and the journal for the Center for Fortean Zoology, which is Animals and Men, I've been published in. And so once you get published, you can really start calling yourself, as a kid, you can really start calling yourself a researcher, and you kind of get looked at differently because you have gone that extra mile and you have done the extensive research necessary to get something published. And I think as a kid getting into this, if you don't want to wait till you're an adult and you want to get working in the field now, I think that it's kind of essential because it's always looked at in everything. I give talks at a lot of different conferences, and one of the first questions when I'm asked on the application forms or the initial emails, if they're interested in having me speak, is, have you been published, and if so, in what? And so it really has been this important aspect of the field that you might not like, but it's a very easy and good way to get your name out. And I can definitely say if I hadn't been published before, I wouldn't have my Crypto Kid radio show, and I wouldn't have a lot of these experiences that I do now.
Well, Colin, this has been a wonderful hour, and really appreciate, seeing you kind of, mature and grow as a knowledge base and researcher on the subject, and certainly encourage others to get out there as well and follow Colin's podcast and radio show, especially the younger generation. I think it'll be very inspiring for you. Can you share a little bit about how folks pick up that program and again when it airs?
Sure. So my radio show is called The Crypto Kid, hosted by myself, Colin Schneider, and it is on live every Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you can listen to the show at WCJVradio.com. And WCJV Radio is a digital broadcasting network that I'm a part of. So if you want to listen to me and another guest talk about cryptids for an hour every Monday, you can go to WCJVradio.com to check it out. And there's a chat room that you can join in and ask questions. And it's just a great time. I love doing it. I always try to give this fresh perspective on some lesser-known aspects of the creatures. I mean, I've done shows talking about with my good friend Ronald Murphy. We spent an hour talking about the archetypes of cryptids, the man-beast idea, and then the lake monsters, and all those aspects around the world and why they're all the same around the world. And then I spent, like I previously said, Brian Parsons, we spent an hour talking about the eastern cougar, the possibility that's still around, and then black panthers. And I've also spent an hour talking with Timothy Renner, who's a great friend of mine. And we talked about historical encounters of Bigfoot in Pennsylvania from the 1800s to the early 1900s. And there's a lot of weird stuff in those accounts. So I really try to avoid, well, this person who's coming on experienced such and such with Bigfoot or saw a lake monster at one time, because while I do think that's an essential part of podcasting with cryptozoology, that's not what I'm trying to do with my show. I want to get the weird parts and the fresher aspects and the things that people don't always know about. And I really want to get the lesser known stuff better known for the next generation.
Well, thanks again, Colin, for coming on. We certainly appreciate it. Again, for the next generation, got, of course, Colin Schneider as a bridge. And for the younger generation, join Squatch Scouts. Take a peek at the program. I think the kids will really enjoy it. And our goal is to inspire the next generation, promote research and discovery, and really teach kind of the scientific method then on data collection and help inspire, get kids outside. So, Paul, any final thoughts?
Colin, you're doing great things, my friend. It's been a pleasure having you on Sasquatch Syndicate. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. I had a really great time, and I'm really looking forward to hearing it and having it get up.
You bet. Take care. This concludes our April 2018 podcast. Sasquatch Syndicate will return on Tuesday, May 1st. Thanks to all our listeners and those who have been out to our website and those who have joined us on social media. Sasquatch is a controversial subject, so for all the believers and disbelievers, and those that will tell you they have all the answers, just remember, we're flying through space at 700 miles per hour. Buckle up.